Master Chief Petty Officer John Corrigan retired, had run out of road. After his wife died and her parents kicked him out, he drove north with his last few $1,000s and his combat dog, Dutch, until the truck and his spirit both threatened to quit. In the high Montana winter, he bought a snowed-in cabin for the price of its back taxes, expecting only a quiet place to disappear. But on the second day, Dutch, the scarred Malinois who dragged him from a bombing in Saint-Jean, froze and began to dig at the hearthstone, and behind it waited a secret sealed for decades that would drag Corrigan back into the world and give him a reason to fight again. The road ended in a small town called Garnet Peak, tucked into a fold of the Rockies where winter arrived in October and didn't leave until May. John Corrigan felt the cold seep through the floorboards of his aging Tacoma, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of a life stripped down to its essential, failing parts: the truck, the dog, and $2,143. Everything else was ash and memory. Sarah was gone, taken by a cancer that had moved faster than any enemy he'd ever faced. Her parents, who had never understood the deployments or the long silences, had waited a month after the funeral before telling him to leave the house that had been Sarah's long before it was his. They said he was a ghost, a hollow man who had brought the war home and let their daughter die alone. He didn't argue. In the raw, quiet moments when he was honest with himself, he knew they weren't entirely wrong. He had been gone for too much of it. He'd been trained to endure, to compartmentalize, to push through the pain. But that training was for the field. It was useless against the quiet, creeping sorrow of a hospital room. So he packed a duffel bag, called Dutch into the cab, and drove away from the life he'd failed to hold together. He drove north, chasing the cold, because it felt like the only honest thing left. The war he carried was a quiet, constant companion. It wasn't the shouting, cinematic nightmare people imagined. It was a pressure behind the eyes, a hyper-awareness of exits and angles, the way his heart would kick at the sound of a truck backfiring. It was the memory of dust, the taste of copper, and the sickening lurch of the world tilting sideways. Sangan Valley, 2011. An IED buried in the threshold of a compound they were clearing. He remembered the flash, the roar that swallowed all sound, and then a profound silence as he lay pinned under a collapsed wall, his leg a ruin of splintered bone and torn muscle. He was drowning in dust, his vision tunneling to a pinprick of light. And then there was pressure on the back of his collar, a frantic, powerful pulling. Dutch, his military working dog, was digging him out, dragging him by his body armor back into the world of the living. The dog had saved his life, and in the years since, he'd continued to do so in smaller, quieter ways. When the memories came at night, a cold sweat slicking his skin, Dutch would press his heavy head against Corrigan's chest, a warm, living anchor in the storm of the past. The dog was the last intact piece of his old life, the only living thing that knew the man he had been and didn't judge the man he had become. He slept in the truck for 3 nights, parked behind a shuttered gas station, the engine running for heat until the gas needle kissed empty. On the 4th day, he walked into the Garnet Peak County Courthouse, a squat brick building that smelled of damp wool and old paper. He was looking for foreclosures, for any piece of land with 4 walls that he could buy with what was left of his cash. He didn't need comfort. He just needed a place to stop running. The place he found was barely a dot on a plat map, a 40-acre parcel with a cabin listed as uninhabitable, sold as is for $500 in back taxes. The county clerk, A man named Elias Thorne, with eyes that had seen 70 winters come and go, looked him over. He saw the military posture that never quite went away, the disciplined economy of movement, the hard set of his jaw. "You service?" Elias asked, his voice a dry rustle. Corrigan gave a single short nod. Elias slid the paperwork across the counter. "Place belonged to a fella named Abe Foster, kept to himself. One day he was just gone. People came looking a while back. Sheriff, some men in suits. Didn't find anything." He paused, his gaze lingering on Corrigan's worn face. "It's a hard place to winter. Gets cut off when the snows get deep. Some places, some histories, are best left alone." Corrigan just signed the papers. He had been trained in hard places. He had survived histories far worse than whatever this forgotten cabin held. He paid in cash, leaving him with just over $1,600. He bought a used chainsaw, gas, and enough canned food to last a month. Then he and Dutch drove up the winding, unplowed road to the property that was now theirs, a final, quiet corner of the world where a man and his dog could wait for the end. The cabin was little more than a dark shape against the snow, a place to disappear into, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The cabin was rough, but its bones were good. The logs were hand-hewn, settled deep into a fieldstone foundation, solid and unmoving against the wind that swept down from the high peaks. Rot had claimed the porch, and the window frames were soft with decay. But the roof, sheathed in rusting tin, looked mostly intact. It was a fortress of solitude, half buried in 3 feet of snow, and it was his. He spent the first day digging out, clearing a path to the door and the outhouse, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scrape of his shovel and the whine of the wind through the lodgepole pines. Inside, the cabin was a single room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace and hearth. It was filled with the debris of an abandoned life, a broken chair, a scattering of tin cans, and a thick layer of dust and mouse droppings. Corrigan worked with a methodical, practiced efficiency that was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. He swept the floor, patched the worst of the drafts with rags, and checked the flue on the old cast-iron wood stove that stood in the corner. It was solid. He got a fire going, and a slow, grudging warmth began to push back against the deep, penetrating cold. Dutch, who had been shadowing his every move, settled by the nascent fire with a heavy sigh, his scarred body finally relaxing. For the first night, there was a semblance of peace. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, and the small circle of light felt like a sanctuary. Corrigan ate cold beans from a can and shared a piece of jerky with Dutch, the quiet companionship a balm on his frayed nerves. He slept in his bag on the floor, the dog a warm, solid presence at his back. He was exhausted, but it was the clean fatigue of physical labor, not the soul-deep weariness that had been his constant companion for months. But on the second day, the dog's behavior changed. Dutch, normally a calm and stoic animal, became agitated. He ignored his food. He paced the length of the single room, his claws clicking on the rough-planked floor. His attention was fixed, utterly and completely, on the massive fieldstone hearth that took up most of the back wall. He would stand before it, his body rigid, the fur on his back ridged, and a low growl would rumble deep in his chest. At first, Corrigan dismissed it. A mouse, a squirrel, some animal that had taken up residence in the chimney. "Leave it, Dutch," he commanded, his voice firm. The dog would look back at him, his intelligent eyes insistent, before turning back to the hearth. He began to paw at one specific stone, a large, flat slab of granite set just to the right of the firebox. He scraped at it, his claws making a dry, scratching sound against the rock and old mortar. The behavior escalated. A sharp, demanding bark broke the stillness of the cabin. Then another. This was not the dog he knew. Dutch was trained, disciplined. This was something else. This was an alert. Corrigan's doubt began to erode under the weight of the dog's unwavering certainty. He knew this animal. Dutch had scented IEDs buried deep in the packed earth of Afghanistan, had alerted him to ambushes in the silent dark. The dog knew things before he did. He always had. Corrigan got up and walked over to the hearth, kneeling beside the agitated Malinois. "What is it, boy? What do you smell?" Dutch whined and nudged the stone with his nose, then looked up at Corrigan, his message clear. "Here. It's here." Corrigan ran his hand over the cold surface of the granite slab. It felt no different from the others. He pushed on it. It was solid, immovable. He knocked on it with his knuckles. The sound was a dull, solid thud. He knocked on the stones around it. Thud. Thud. Then he knocked again on the one Dutch had indicated. And there it was. A subtle difference, a resonance, a faint, almost imperceptible hollowness that shouldn't have been there. He leaned in closer, his eyes tracing the edges of the stone. The mortar was old, crumbling in places, but around this specific slab, it looked different. It was a slightly lighter shade of gray, and the line was too clean, too precise. It wasn't the work of a stonemason from a century ago. It was the work of someone who had cut it out and put it back. Someone had sealed something behind this stone. The dog would not let it go, because the dog knew. And now, so did Corrigan. The quiet place he had sought was not empty after all. It was holding a secret. The feeling that washed over him was not excitement or greed, but a deep, familiar sense of caution. The instincts honed over 2 decades of special operations kicked in, quieting the noise of his grief and focusing his mind to a sharp, clear point. Secrets buried this well were buried for a reason, and that reason was almost always danger. He retrieved the crowbar from his truck, the cold steel heavy in his hand. Dutch watched him, poised and silent, the alert given and the responsibility now past. Corrigan wedged the tip of the crowbar into the fine seam he'd identified and leaned into it. The old mortar cracked and fell away in a shower of gray dust. He worked his way around the stone, methodically breaking the seal. It was slow, hard work. The stone was heavy, set deep. Finally, with a great groaning scrape, it gave way, pivoting inward on a hidden hinge mechanism that was slick with grease and masterfully concealed. The engineering was professional, deliberate. Behind the stone was not a rough-hewn cavity, but a small, dark chamber lined with welded 1/4-inch steel plate. It was a purpose-built safe, hidden within the fabric of the old cabin, and it was full. Stacked neatly inside were 7 military-grade Pelican cases, the kind he knew were airtight, waterproof, and damn near indestructible. A cold dread mixed with a surge of adrenaline. This was not some old prospector's forgotten gold. This was something else entirely. He pulled the first case out. It was heavy. The latches snapped open with a crisp, clean sound. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, were stacks of bearer bonds from a dozen different European banks, their paper crisp and new. He lifted another case. This one was filled with shrink-wrapped bricks of non-sequential $100 bills. A quick count of one brick and a rough multiplication told him he was looking at millions in cash alone. A third case held gold bullion, small, heavy bars stamped with the seal of a Swiss refinery. He worked his way through 6 of the cases, the scale of the find growing with each one. It was an impossible fortune, a king's ransom tucked away in the Montana wilderness. By his conservative estimate, it was well over $180 million. The final case was lighter. He opened it to find not money, but a thick, leather-bound journal, a satellite phone, and a single sealed envelope with the words, "For the next soldier," written on the front in a strong, clear hand. He sat on the floor of the cold cabin, the immense, dangerous weight of his discovery settling around him. He opened the journal. The first page read, "My name is Abraham Foster, Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army Rangers, retired." Corrigan felt a shock of recognition, the name from the deed, the man who had vanished. He read on, the journal entries painting a grim picture. Foster had taken a private security job after leaving the service, working for a powerful resource conglomerate called Titan Minerals. He was their fixer, their paymaster, handling off-the-books transactions and ensuring their operations in unstable regions ran smoothly. But he had discovered the truth. Titan wasn't just bending rules, they were breaking nations. They were funding insurgents, assassinating environmental activists, and bribing officials to seize control of mineral rights worth billions. The money in this safe was their slush fund, the blood money Foster had been tasked with managing. He had stolen it, planning to expose them, but they had hunted him. The journal detailed his flight, his paranoia, his decision to hide the money and the evidence here, in a place he thought no one would ever find. The last entry was dated 2 years prior. "They're closing in. I think they found me. The local sheriff, a man named Rollins, he's on their payroll. He came by today, asking questions that were too specific. If you're reading this, they got me. The sat phone has one number programmed in it. A man at the DOJ I trust. Don't trust anyone in this county, especially not Rollins." Corrigan's blood ran cold. He picked up the envelope and broke the seal. The letter inside was short. "Soldier, if you found this, you're probably at the end of your own road, same as me. I hope this gives you a new one. Use it to do some good. Don't let the bastards win. Watch your 6. Abe Foster's war had just become his. For 2 days, Corrigan did nothing. He sat with the knowledge, the weight of Abe Foster's legacy, and $180 million pressing down on the roof of his small cabin. He resealed the hearth, carefully mixing dust and dirt into fresh mortar to make it look old and undisturbed. He hid the pelican cases in a shallow space under the floorboards he'd discovered near the back wall, covering them with dirt and the old planks. He kept the journal and the satellite phone with him, wrapped in an oilskin bag. He was a keeper now, a guardian of a dead man's war. His training dictated his actions: secure the asset, assess the threat, create a plan. The desire to disappear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard sense of purpose. He owed it to Foster. He owed it to the uniform they had both worn. On the 3rd morning, as a pale sun filtered through the pines, he saw the truck. It was a new Ford F-250, clean and white, stark against the gray landscape. It moved slowly up his long, unpaved driveway and came to a stop a respectful distance from the cabin. A man in a crisp brown uniform got out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a politician's easy smile that didn't reach his eyes. The badge on his chest read, "Sheriff Rollins." Dutch was on his feet before the truck door even closed, a low, guttural growl vibrating through the floorboards. Corrigan put a hand on the dog's back, a silent command to hold. He stepped outside, pulling the cabin door shut behind him, positioning himself on the broken-down porch, a slight elevation advantage. He kept his hands loose, visible. Rollins ambled forward, his smile fixed in place. "Morning," he said, his voice a friendly boom. "Just making the rounds. Saw someone had finally bought the old Foster place. I'm Sheriff Rollins. Welcome to the county." "Corrigan," John said, his voice flat, offering nothing more. Rollins's eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, did a slow, methodical sweep. They took in the newly stacked firewood, the patched window frames, the tracks in the snow. They were the eyes of a hunter assessing terrain. "Heard you got it for a song," Rollins continued, rocking back on his heels. "Place has been sitting empty a couple years now, since Abe Foster took off." "That what happened?" Corrigan asked. "He took off?" Rollins gave a slight shrug. "That's the official story. Man had demons. A lot of you guys do." The casual "you guys" was a probe, a test. He was fishing. "Never could prove otherwise. Some folks from the city came by last year asking after him. An insurance company, they said. Guess he was worth something to someone." The sheriff's gaze drifted to the hearth chimney, lingering there for a fraction of a second too long. It was an infinitesimal tell, but to a man trained to read micro-expressions, it was a flare in the dark. Dutch's growl deepened. "Dog doesn't seem to like me," Rollins said with a chuckle, but his eyes were on the animal, cold and measuring. "He's particular," Corrigan said. The sheriff stayed for another minute, making small talk about the weather and the roads, but his attention was elsewhere. He was scanning, mapping, assessing. Finally, he tipped his hat. "Well, you need anything? You know who to call." He walked back to his truck and drove away. Corrigan waited until the sound of the engine faded completely. Then he walked to the edge of the woods, following a faint depression in the snow Rollins hadn't seen from the drive. Tucked behind a thicket of firs was a single set of footprints leading to a spot that had a clear line of sight to the cabin's front and the chimney. And half buried in the snow at the base of a tree was a freshly discarded cigarette butt. The filter was still warm. Someone had been watching him long before the sheriff arrived. The net was already tightening. The warmth of the cigarette butt was a clear message. He was being observed, his tenancy in this forgotten place noted and evaluated. The friendly visit from Rollins was a reconnaissance mission. They knew Foster had been here, and they suspected he hadn't left empty-handed. Now, a new variable, Corrigan, had entered the equation. He spent the next day fortifying his position, not like a man expecting a siege, but with the quiet, methodical preparation of a professional. He cut deadfall, creating subtle obstacles on the narrow access road. He rigged a simple alarm using tin cans and tripwire on the perimeter of the clearing. They were low-tech, simple measures, but they would give him a few precious seconds of warning. He needed more information. Foster's journal was a map of the conspiracy, but he needed to see the local terrain. He needed to know who else in this small, isolated county was under Rollins's thumb, leaving Dutch on guard, a silent, furry sentinel watching from the cabin window. Corrigan drove his Tacoma back into Garnet Peak. He didn't go to the sheriff's office. He went back to the courthouse. The old clerk, Elias Thorne, was gone. In his place sat a young woman, her nameplate reading Maya Singh, County Clerk. She was sharp, with intelligent, wary eyes that took in his scuffed boots and military bearing. He told her he was trying to clear up the title on his new property and wanted to see the full deed history. It was a plausible lie. She tapped at her keyboard, her brow furrowing as she pulled up the digital records. That's odd, she murmured, more to herself than to him. The chain of title is clean, but the final transfer, from Abraham Foster to the county for tax default, the signature scan looks off. She pulled up an older document, a property survey Foster had signed years earlier. She put them side by side on the screen. Even to Corrigan's untrained eye, the difference was obvious. The signature on the deed transfer was a forgery. Elias Thorne was the clerk who processed this, Maya said, her voice dropping. He was encouraged to take an early retirement a few weeks later. Sheriff Rollins was very involved in that process. She looked up at him, her gaze direct. Elias is a good man. He wouldn't have overlooked a forgery like this unless he was under pressure. She was smart, and she was brave. She was giving him a piece of the puzzle without being asked. He pushed a little further. Foster, the sheriff said he just took off. Maya's expression hardened. People take off around here sometimes, especially if they own land that Titan Minerals is interested in. The name from the journal. They're the biggest employer in 3 counties, she continued, her voice now barely a whisper. They own a lot of people. Rollins provides their corporate security on a county contract. It's all very convenient. She told him about an environmental group that had been protesting Titan's mining practices. Their leader, a man named Ben Carter, had his car go off a mountain road during a clear summer night. It was ruled an accident. Others who had spoken out had faced sudden tax audits, permit denials, or worse. It was a pattern of quiet, systematic intimidation, all orbiting Titan Minerals and enforced by the local sheriff. The dead man's warning, "Don't trust Rollins," was no longer just a name. It was the center of a web of corruption and fear that had this entire valley in its grip. He thanked Maya for her time. As he was leaving, she stopped him. "Be careful, Mr. Corrigan. This valley has a way of swallowing people who ask too many questions." The warning hung in the air as he walked out into the cold afternoon. That night, driving back to the cabin in the gathering dusk, he found it. The heavy chain he used to block the entrance to his road had been cut cleanly with bolt cutters, then hooked back together to look untouched from a distance. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a statement of access. "We can get to you whenever we want." The cut chain was a clear escalation. Surveillance had shifted to intimidation. Corrigan knew the next phase would be physical. They would come for the money, and they would not be gentle about it. He spent the next 24 hours preparing for a fight, his mind falling back into the familiar rhythms of mission planning. He worked on the cabin, reinforcing the door and shuttering the windows with thick planks, leaving only small, strategic firing slits. He moved the bulk of the money and Foster's journal to a secondary, pre-planned cache deep in the woods, a place he could fall back to if the cabin was compromised. He kept only one case, the sat phone, and his own meager gear with him. He was not a man defending a fortune. He was a soldier defending a position. The purpose that had settled over him was now razor-sharp. He would not let Foster's sacrifice be for nothing. He would not let these men win. He owed a debt to the dead. The attack came on the 3rd night, under the cover of a blinding blizzard that had swept down from the peaks, reducing visibility to near zero and cutting the valley off from the outside world. The wind shrieked, piling snow into massive drifts. It was the perfect cover for an assault. But the storm that blinded his enemies also sharpened his other senses. He sat in the dark, the wood stove burning low, listening. Dutch lay at his feet, not sleeping, but in a state of coiled readiness, his head up, ears twitching, tasting the air. Around 2 a.m., The dog let out a single, low woof. It wasn't an alarm bark. It was an announcement. They're here. Corrigan moved to one of the slits he'd cut in the shutters, peering into the swirling chaos of the storm. He saw them as fleeting shapes, dark against the white. 4 of them, moving in a practiced tactical spread, using the trees and the storm for cover. They weren't local thugs. They were professionals. Hired muscle. He saw the glint of long guns. Rollins hadn't come himself. He'd sent his dogs. Corrigan felt the old, cold calm settle over him. His heart rate was steady, his breathing controlled. He was not trapped in the cabin with them. They were trapped in the storm with him. He let them get closer, let them believe they had the advantage of surprise. One man broke from the tree line, making a dash for the back of the cabin, likely planning to set a fire as a diversion. Corrigan was already moving. He slipped out a small secondary exit he'd rigged in the back wall, a loose set of logs he could move silently. He was a ghost in the storm, using the noise of the wind to mask his movements. He came up behind the first man as he was fumbling with a can of accelerant and a lighter. The man never heard him. A swift, precise strike to the base of the skull, and he went down without a sound. 1 down. The others, seeing their point man disappear into the snow, grew hesitant. They called out his name, their voices snatched away by the wind. Their cohesion was broken. Corrigan used their confusion, circling around them, a predator in his element. He engaged the second man near the woodpile, using the terrain to his advantage, disarming him and neutralizing him with a series of crippling joint locks. 2 down. The remaining 2 realized something was terribly wrong. They fell back towards the front of the cabin, firing blindly into the dark. A round splintered the doorframe. Inside, Dutch barked furiously. One of the men, panicked, kicked the door in. He stumbled inside, his rifle sweeping the empty room, and then Dutch launched himself out of the darkness. He hit the man square in the chest, a 75-pound blur of fur and fury. The man screamed, falling backward, his rifle discharging into the ceiling. The 4th man, hearing the scream, rushed in after him. As he crossed the threshold, Corrigan, who had re-entered through the back, met him from the shadows. The fight was short, brutal, and silent. But as Corrigan subdued the final intruder, he heard a pained yelp from the porch. The first man, the one Dutch had taken down, had managed to draw a large knife as he fell, and in his thrashing had buried it deep in the dog's flank. Dutch collapsed to the floor, blood pooling on the rough wood, his breath coming in ragged pants. The sight of his dog, his loyal friend, bleeding on the floor, broke through Corrigan's combat focus. For a moment, the cold professional vanished, and all that was left was a man seeing the last good thing in his life about to be taken from him. This was their biggest mistake. They had made it personal. The rage that surged through Corrigan was a white-hot, silent thing. He secured the 4 intruders, binding them tightly with rope from his truck. He checked Dutch's wound. It was deep, a nasty slice along his ribs, but it had missed his vital organs. It was bleeding heavily, but it was treatable. He had to work fast. Using his old field medic kit, he cleaned the wound as best he could, packed it with sterile gauze, and wrapped it tightly, the dog whining softly but licking his hand in a gesture of absolute trust. The lowest point had been reached. The one soul who had stood by him through everything was hurt because of this fight he had inherited. That clarified everything. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about justice for Abe Foster anymore. It was about protecting the last thing he had left to protect. With Dutch stabilized, Corrigan went back to the intruders. He used the satellite phone from Foster's kit. He didn't call the number for the Department of Justice. Not yet. He found one of the men's wallets and a cell phone. He looked up the number for the State Highway Patrol dispatch in Helena, 100 miles away and far outside Rawlins's jurisdiction. He made the call, his voice calm and level. "This is John Corrigan. I'm at the old Foster property off Highway 200 in Garnett County. I have 4 armed men in my custody who attempted to murder me. One of my animals is injured. I am a retired Navy Master Chief. I am armed and I will defend my position. I request immediate assistance from the State Patrol and an ambulance. Do not, I repeat, do not notify the Garnett County Sheriff's Department. The local sheriff is compromised." The dispatcher, trained for crisis calls, heard the authority and control in his voice. She promised to send a unit, but warned the blizzard would make the roads nearly impassable. It could be hours. That was fine. He had time. Next, he dialed the number from Foster's journal, the one for the contact at the DOJ. A man answered, his voice groggy with sleep. Corrigan explained who he was, what he had found, and what had just happened. His words clipped and precise. He mentioned Abe Foster, Titan Minerals, and Sheriff Rawlins. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Stay put, Master Chief. Don't let anyone on that property. Help is coming." The rest of the night was a long, tense vigil. Corrigan sat with Dutch, murmuring to the dog, keeping him warm by the fire, while the 4 intruders lay bound and silent on the floor. Just before dawn, through the thinning snow, he saw the first set of headlights. They weren't the blue and red of a patrol car. They were the bright white of a heavy-duty pickup truck. Sheriff Rawlins had arrived. He got out of his truck alone, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Corrigan!" he yelled over the wind. "I heard a disturbance call on the scanner. What the hell is going on in there?" Corrigan didn't answer. He stood just inside the shattered doorway, his own pistol in his hand, a silhouette in the dim light. He wasn't going to let Rawlins control the scene. A few minutes later, the blue and red lights of the State Patrol finally appeared, their heavy-duty SUVs churning through the deep snow, and behind them, 2 black, unmarked Suburbans. The DOJ had moved fast. Federal agents in tactical gear stepped out, their weapons held at a low ready. The standoff was over before it began. Rawlins's face went from confident authority to pale, slack-jawed shock as he realized he was no longer the highest power in the valley. The reckoning had begun. The unraveling was swift and decisive. The federal agents took command of the scene with cold efficiency, ignoring Rawlins's blustered protests. The 4 captured men, faced with federal charges and the grim reality of their situation, began to talk. They were private contractors, hired by a shell corporation that was quickly traced back to Titan Minerals' security division. They implicated Rawlins as the man who had hired them, not just for this assault, but for a dozen other acts of intimidation and violence over the years. Rawlins was arrested on his own land, his face a mask of disbelief as the FBI agents put him in cuffs. The fortress of corruption he had built over a decade crumbled in a single morning. The evidence Corrigan had protected, Abe Foster's meticulous journal, the bearer bonds, the records of illegal transactions, was the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. Federal warrants were executed in 3 states. Titan Minerals' corporate headquarters was raided. The investigation reached all the way to its board of directors, a collection of powerful ex-politicians and lobbyists who had believed they were untouchable. They were wrong. Abe Foster's last mission was finally complete. The vanished were named. The silenced were heard. and the men who had built an empire on greed and blood were brought down by a dead ranger and a retired SEAL who had just wanted to be left alone. Months passed. The snows melted, and a fragile spring came to the high country. The cabin was repaired, the shattered door replaced, the bullet holes patched. It was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of peace, not of resignation. Dutch healed, a new silver scar tracing a line through his dark fur, a physical reminder of his loyalty. He limped slightly on cold mornings, but his spirit was undiminished. The $180 million, after being processed as evidence, was subject to a federal asset forfeiture program. A substantial portion, a finder's fee and reward that amounted to more money than Corrigan could have imagined, was awarded to him. But the money felt like a secondary concern. The true inheritance was the sense of purpose Foster had left him. In his last letter, Foster had written of a dream: to use the money to create a foundation that would buy land and build small, quiet homes for veterans who, like him, had come home from the war only to find themselves lost and without a place to anchor themselves. Corrigan made that dream his own. He established the Foster's Ridge Foundation, and the first piece of land he purchased was the 40 acres surrounding his own cabin, protecting it forever. One afternoon, as he was splitting wood, a small rental car made its way up the long driveway. A young woman got out. It was his daughter, Chloe. She'd seen his name in the national news reports about the Titan Minerals takedown. For the first time in years, she had called him. Now, she was here. There was an awkward silence between them, a chasm of unspoken grief and years of distance. "I was worried," she said finally, her voice small. "I read what happened. I'm sorry. For everything." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. Dutch, ever the diplomat, trotted over and nudged her hand with his wet nose. She knelt and wrapped her arms around the old dog's neck. "Hey, Dutchie," she whispered. It was a start. He had come to this place to disappear, to let the world forget him. But instead, it had become the place that saved him. The discovery in the hearth, the words of a dead man, and the unwavering loyalty of a good dog had pulled him back from the brink and given him a new mission. He looked at his daughter, at the solid little cabin, at the vast, silent mountains that stood guard around them. He was no longer a ghost. He was home.